Welcome everyone to episode number 10 of Tool House Rock. Today we are glad to be hosting TogetherCrew. Quick summary on Tool House Rock. This is a community call giving Web3 projects a place to showcase what they're working on to the maker community, with a specific focus on the endgame transition and the forthcoming sub-DAOs. Quick plug for a new piece of Tool House Rock, the Tool Shed. This is a website to help make the search for tools a bit more efficient and to have one kind of complete resource of all the calls. Real quick, some disclaimers. Our views are our own and are not representative of MakerDAO as a whole. Inaccuracies are possible. Information changes very quickly in this space, especially if you're viewing this video in the distant future. And finally, none of this is financial or legal advice, purely informational. Okay, let's take a closer look at TogetherCrew. After analyzing TogetherCrew, we feel the most relevant alignment artifacts are ecosystem support, accessibility, and core resiliency. And the impact areas that we see TogetherCrew making the most impact is community building, transparency, and governance. Okay, I'm happy to introduce Danielle from TogetherCrew. Thank you for joining us today and sharing your time with us.
Thank you very much for having me. Pleasure to be here. So let me go and screen share. There we go. So we are TogetherCrew. We help communities come and stay together. So first, a quick overview of where we're coming from. We're seeing these technological evolution starting from broadcasting like radio, television, etc. around the 1950s. And the most effective way to reach to people is just pay for an advert there and get it to as many people as possible. And so we have essentially the key metrics at the time is kind of like how many people can we get this in front of. Then with the internet, social media, etc., we have these rise around the 2010s of the pay-per-click and targeted advertising. So we can send to a specific demographic and we pay for how many people are clicking on the ad. But as we get now AI, open protocols, etc., defensibility starts to become a very different game. Like we saw the rise of the content marketing, but also now we are saturated with content everywhere. So content itself doesn't mean much. What starts to have a meaning is humans' relationships, is community. In a world that is global and you can go anywhere, it feels so daunting that we have like the opposite reflect. We want to go to smaller groups where we can trust people, where we can cut through the noise, and so on, and have essentially a small trusted community that we can really believe in. And so we start to have also businesses following this trend and catching up with what is a fundamental human structure, that is that we live in communities and have been doing that through thousands of years. So for businesses, this is a matter, and I mean here businesses in a very general sense, like I'm also talking about DAOs, protocols, public goods, etc. But like what we're talking about here in terms of how they can relate with their users or customers is areas like loyalty, meaning retention and helping these people have a sense of belonging so they want to stay around, is being able to cut through the noise through peer recommendations, especially more and more important as we have AI creating all sort of kind of dream worlds and targeted advertising and so on. What we want to know is who can we trust? And we can trust people who are a little bit like us. We can trust their recommendations. So the concept of advocacy becomes increasingly important in communities. And of course, we have value creation through feedback, ideas, suggestions. In the case of DAOs, actually contribution, participation in governance, etc. However, the issue is that throughout all of these, building community requires a tremendous amount of work, like putting a tremendous amount of emotional work to build relationships. And so when we're trying to strategize around it, when we're trying to figure out what is it that we should focus on in community, are we doing a good job or not? Is this giving us the expected results? Do we have a strong community that when the shock happens will join shoulder to shoulder? Or on the other hand, is it going to fall apart? And how can we tell the difference? And so the key problem that we have is that fundamentally community builders are shooting in the dark. We don't have a way to assess these. We don't really know where we should focus to have the most impact in terms of building a community. So as a result of that, we end up doing a little bit of spray and pray, doing all kind of initiatives, following best practices, but these best practices are not even proven. So we end up wasting a lot of time, money, and overall missing on a bunch of growth. And so what we're doing, if we start to look into it, is like, okay, so what are we paying attention to? And as we're still very much stuck in metrics that come from kind of like the 1950s or 2010. So we have the passive audience metrics of like how many people are watching. So how many followers do you have? How many members do you have in Discord and so on? But this gives us very little meaning. These people might be engaged or not, they might be active or not, they might care about it or not, we don't really know. And then we have the engagement metrics like retweets and likes, but they're very flickery. And so the issue with engagement is that it's relatively easy to measure. And from the whole Web2, we know how to measure these, but more engagement doesn't mean a healthier community. It doesn't mean a community that's going to have more loyalty, more advocacy, that's going to be more resilient. We see, for example, that the engagement metrics go up when there is a conflict. When there is a lot of tension in the community and people are unsure and they're fighting each other and name-calling each other, engagement metrics go up and then they go down pretty suddenly. Equally, we have some communities that are relatively quiet and everyone tremendously cares about them, and others that are very noisy and they're just a thing of the moment, and in 2 months they will have disappeared. Also, as well, the more the engagement metrics start to go up, the more we have risks of burnout, because people are hyper engaged. They're participating too much. That doesn't necessarily mean it's the most sustainable nor the most effective form of engagement, because we have a lot of noise happening, a lot of people sharing information. But is from all of this engagement, can we actually translate these to something productive? Are we actually understanding each other? Is it actually really working to satisfy our needs, the things that brought us into the community and so on? And so what we're fundamentally arguing here is that even though community is becoming increasingly important, what we have been measuring is not really community. And because we measure the wrong things, we pay attention to the wrong things, we focus on the wrong things, and we get counterproductive outcomes. So we started about a year ago seeing community managers asking, how do we really measure community? We know that likes and retweets are not enough. So how do we really measure it? And what's come out of that, first a research project, and now developing a product to bring these to people, is TogetherCrew. And fundamentally, what we're trying to do is enable people to have precise and effective community building through insights, personalized recommendations, and then using all of these insights and recommendations to as well bring in some automations that can make community builders more effective. So we try to eliminate the guesswork and using the analytics, so you can have the actionable insights and recommendations, and then replace the tedious tasks using the precise data-driven automations, and through these increase at least 10x the impact that a community builder can have, as well as them knowing where are we right now, so they can focus in between all of the different areas that they might need to focus is how much attention should go to community right now versus X or Y or Z. And how do we do this? So we have developed our own analysis framework. We're combining on-chain and off-chain data, mostly about gathering data from as many platforms as possible where a community is hanging out. Because we have most digital communities or even hybrid companies that we have a tremendously rich data footprint, but this one is spread across platforms. So you'll have like the Discord analytics, the Twitter analytics, and so on. But where the data really comes to life and we can really start to understand it a lot better is when we can bring this data together across platforms and not have it siloed in the different places. And then we apply primarily two techniques. So social network analysis, this is understanding how are the people interacting with each other in the network. So not just only what's the behavior of an individual, but what's the context of the behavior of that individual, in which position they are, who they engage with, and so on. And we also apply some machine learning models, text analysis, and so on. And with these, we can start to move now from what is a passive audience and move towards more measuring the interdependence between community members, how together they create value, how together they engage each other, they work together, they collaborate. And also these as a social network, as a structure, is it resilient or not? And what can happen to it under different conditions? So furthering with our research, we started to map communities as a series of nested systems. So it's understanding that the community is not just a thing, but a little bit like a body that has different organs within. The community also has different subsystems, different nested systems that all need to be healthy. So to understand health as a holistic concept, we know that we need to have healthy individuals who are happy with it. If the individuals are unhealthy, the community is going to be unhealthy. If the people are burning out, your community is going to be fragile. Then we have to have good relationship between these individuals. Same thing, if people are arguing, if they're hating each other, the community is going to be fragile. And then we have the cliques, teams, subgroups that are forming, and these themselves need to be functional. And finally, the community needs to be nested within a bigger ecosystem that itself needs to be healthier. Because if the ecosystem collapses, most likely the community is going to collapse with it. So we are taking all of these and applying the techniques that I was mentioning to then try to bring it down to fundamentally two jobs that we have identified that community managers need to do. They need to manage people and they need to manage information. So for the managing people, we're then mapping the social network. We help them understand what's the position, the roles that people are having. We can then break down members into the different categories. I'll show you a little bit more when we go into the product demo. And this then enables us to engage with people based on the role that they're fulfilling in the community as the data is doing. So instead of trying to understand that from Discord being the fire hose of information or across a bunch of different Telegram groups or in Twitter and so on, you can start to map what role are they fulfilling and how can I help the individuals find their optimal level of engagement, whatever that is for them. So you empathize, you understand how their behavior is evolving over time, and then you can help them chart their own course through the community. And then for the knowledge management side, we take all of these different data pipelines, and then we can gather all of the data from the community to also create an AI that then can help you answer questions of like, what is that team doing? How do I participate in governance? Or the different questions that members can take. And it works a little bit as a hive mind. So for the members, it can ask different questions related to customer support or more complex questions around how they participate in the network and what sort of information they need to be able to participate effectively. So it helps a lot with organizational accessibility. And then in the other side, we also have it as a recommendation engine for the community builders to assist them in understanding what's happening. So a little bit more on these is that depending on the structure of the network, we can start to create a series of KPIs to tell you whether this social network is resistant or not. So for example, we can calculate how much this network is depending on a few individuals, like the social networks on the left. You can see they're very, very concentrated across a few nodes, across a few individuals that are serving a little bit like traffic controllers. And in these situations, these sort of networks will be relatively fast or making decisions on moving forward, but they're equally fragile because if something happens to the few individuals at the center, the whole network could collapse. On the other hand, we have the networks more towards the right that are more decentralized, they're more distributed, and we have more many-to-many communication. So that has the advantage of increased resilience, less of a single point of failure, But with these networks on the right, the challenge sometimes can be to converge and move forward in a single direction. So alignment starts to become a challenge. And you have a sort of golden ratio in the middle that we can calculate mathematically, where information is flowing effectively across these clusters. People talk enough to each other. There is enough of a closeness of connection. So essentially, I might not know everyone, but everyone is a friend of a friend or a contact of a contact. So still by proxy, the information is flowing well, and I have good context over all of the community, versus if the network is too separated, is too distant, then at that point, it's just going to be too hard for the information to flow. And we can calculate these sort of things mathematically, and as well benchmark across communities to tell you, well, compared, let's say, to the average or DAOs, or compared to other communities in your ecosystem, this is how you are in this specific metric. And based on that, issue a series of recommendations of how you can try to achieve a balance, or at least be aware of what are the dangers and the negatives that can happen from being in that position, and so take action. And now we've been running this for a bit. We are very happy to have some leading names as early adopters of our tool. We received some grants from Aave, Near, Polygon, Aragon, Cello, etc., that have supported us in the journey, and that have then been some of the early beneficiaries of our technology when we're doing custom reports. Then slowly we've been automating those custom reports into a live dashboard. And this is what I'll show you then in a second in the live demo. So let me take a video and let me put this for everyday tactical member management. So community help. Here is the main thing. We have 3 sections. So we have the community insight section, where you'll have more tactical day-to-day things, a community health that has the KPI sort of assessments, and then a survey section that I'll explain in a second. Now, these, as I was telling you, is calculate based on these network graphs. So we're not just calculating engagement, essentially not just like whether someone is posting or something like that, but we're calculating interactions. When someone engages with another member, and it's through these interactions that we calculate the tool. So compared to other analytic tools, you might find that there are less engagement, essentially, that's calculated in the network, because a lot of the engagement sometimes is empty, is our messages, our spam, are things that people don't find value, so they don't engage with it. And for us, what's important is when people are coming in contact with each other. So that's what we're really calculating here. And then you can use these to figure out which members are fulfilling which roles. So for example, the big dots, they are at risk of being overwhelmed because they're receiving really a lot of messages, while the ones that are in the periphery, they might even disengage. So we use this data, and then we bucket it into the different categories here. So total active members, those who are new, those who are consistently active and carrying some organizational memory, and then the vital members. Then from these, we can break it down into line graphs, analyze as well onboarding, how people are joining the network, whether they're activating, whether they're still participating and taking part. And we can see the member activity over time and the evolution of these graphics. And also for the disengagement, we can see not only whether someone disengaged, but what role they were fulfilling in the social network before. So they were a newly active member, or they were consistently active, for example, or they were really a vital member who was core of the social tissue. And then we're going to take very different actions to engage with them, or ask them for feedback, or figure out why they're leaving, or understand how we should react to this. Because say a newly active member, maybe they were just asking a question. There is no need for them to stay around. If a vital member leaves, is very different. And then if we run a campaign to re-engage members, we can also track these down, seeing how many of them have returned to the network. And of course, we see that over time as well. So in the community help section, I was telling you about before the decentralization score that's below. And here above, we have fragmentation, which is another one of the key scores that we calculate. That's essentially how much is this community divided into sub-communities that don't necessarily talk to each other, or on the other hand, is it too enmeshed? Is it like a hairball? Everyone is talking with everyone to the point that you can no longer distinguish what are the subgroups or teams. And if it's too enmeshed, people are likely going to be a little bit overwhelmed, trying to keep up with too many conversations, too many relationships. But if it's too fragmented, it's going to be siloed. So once we can calculate it, these are the recommendations that we're telling you, and it's based essentially on what's your position specifically of your community across this metric, and what are the actions that you can take to take it more to a balanced place. And then here we have the same thing, like if it's too concentrated or too decentralized, which I was explaining you before, kind of like similar thing. And you'll have different pros and cons, different things to pay attention depending on your community. But as we go through more and more of these indicators, and we're building a few more, working with different social and network scientists, then we can really help you. What are the sort of initiatives that you should really pay attention to do this? Then to enrich all of these data, we have the pulse survey section. So this for now is a Discord bot that is in the process of being built. But instead of running a big survey every few months, this allows you to run micro surveys on recurring basis. So every 2 weeks, you can ask 2 free questions to your members and then gauge over time how that's evolving, and as well benchmark with others. So we have created, working as well with social scientists and work scientists, different templates like this one here that you can use with predefined questions. This allows us to benchmark and helps us go a lot deeper into some of the specific cases, or let's say sub areas that allow you to create a healthy community or not. So to create them, you just kind of go there. You can define when it starts, when it stops, the repetition, the channels in which you wanted to see, which sort of members will get access. You can tailor the questions and so on. And once you're done with it, you can simply create the survey and it will get automated as a recurring pulse survey. So that's the core of the tool. I hope you find it interesting. As I was saying, we are TogetherCrew, trying to help communities to stay and remain together. Let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you for that demo, Danielle. One question, the disengaged members section, would that be like someone hasn't logged on in the last 2 weeks, or they haven't actively sort of communicated with another community member?
They haven't actively communicated with another community member. And unfortunately, the logging on is not something that we can track very well. So there is a blind spot around lurkers. But in the research that we have seen around lurkers are valuable still for a community, in the sense that it can pass information to other places. But their level of understanding of the community is always very, very superficial, because unless you grapple with a topic, your understanding is always going to be a little bit shallow. You might have heard the thing that people say that if you read about the topic, you understand 10%, but if you try to teach it to someone else, you understand 80% more, or something else like that. Is when you engage in a conversation with other people, you start to go a lot deeper, and that's when you really build those sticky relationships, is through connecting to other humans. So we're not counting the lurkers as part of the, let's say, engaged community members.
Great. Yeah, no, that makes sense, certainly. One other question I had was in regard to the AI chatbot. What's sort of the process for optimizing it for different clients or projects in order to generate the most relevant answers for varying projects?
Yeah, sure. So the key there is having access to the right information and platforms. So it's mostly about getting it to have access to the platforms that a specific community is using. And then the bot itself can start to understand what's the relevance of that content. But we can also, working with the community, we can also give them some nudges. So we can say, for example, is like, this is some content that has never been reviewed, is kind of old content, etc., versus this is the last version that was carefully tailored and loads of people work on it together. So you can pass some of those insights to the bot, so it might prefer certain data sources instead of others. That being said, the way the bot works and is multiple AI agents that collaborate together to create the response. In the front, you only see a single interface, but in the back, we actually have multiple AI agents. And the way it's structured is that it breaks down the question into multiple sub-questions that are simpler, and then it will go and find the best data source for each of the sub-questions. Then it will kind of pit them against each other, create a summary, and then give you the answer. So it's a bot that is designed, let's say, more than simply to give you a link. It's a bot that is designed as a sort of research assistant or PA that can go and search for the best information, make sense of it, and then come back to you with a more thorough answer.
Do you have this like a demo of this, Daniel? This sounds super interesting, actually. I don't know if there's a way of seeing it, like how it interacts and how it progresses.
Sorry, which one?
Like breaking down the problem and making sure that the whole process is there.
Most likely, yes. I'll have to check with my team how the logs are being stored, because I'm not on the data science side. So I don't know exactly how they visualize that information. So I don't have access to it right now. But I could come back, and probably there is a log in the database, because I know part of the bot, what it's doing is creating like halfway summaries of certain information, or like summarizing a thread, summarizing a channel, etc., and then storing those to construct the bigger answers. And hence that information will be stored in some format in our database. But whether that can be visualized, I'm not sure.
Makes sense. I'm not sure if, oh, sorry, go ahead, please.
Oh, thanks, Juan. Yeah, I kind of joined, I guess, midway. So I'm sorry if, my question would make you repeat some information. But I'm just really curious. I think you said it's using machine learning. And do I understand correctly that it's using that to also measure the quality of the discourse? So does it use some kind of sentiment analysis, and how does that actually work in terms of how is the model trained to perceive the information that people are writing?
Yeah, sure. So for now, and bear in mind, like, this is still evolving, but we started first primarily focusing on the social network analysis, just because there is already a lot of research on how different communication patterns in a social network have been validated to show certain outcomes for an organization or for a community. So we started by leveraging a lot of that. Then on top of that, we are starting to map the sentiment for the specific relationships. And this is still a little bit a work in progress, but the sentiment analysis, essentially the bot can, the sentiment analysis tool can understand whether an interaction in between people was emotionally positive, negative, that's the basic. Then building on top of that, whether it led to a resolution or not. And if it didn't lead to a resolution, then you can as well start to track in the social network how this tension or conflict in a relationship is affecting the network over time. So the exact impact that this can have, or let's say be able to predict that if you have this amount of conflict, or exactly this structure, your token price or your customer acquisition cost, or the number of new people joining will change by X%. That's the machine learning algorithm can start to do a lot of that hard work, or predict, for example, which members are likely to disengage before they disengage. But we don't yet have enough data to have a robust enough model to predict these things. But that's the direction it can go. So once we're able to do this, we can say, okay, this person is likely to disengage. The basic, if we could tell a community manager, but sometimes that breaches data privacy. But instead of that, we can start to automate a series of actions. So send this person a well-being kit, a survey form, or try to engage them and show them how they can participate in governance, etc., to advocate for the changes that they would want to make the community safer. Or equally, when we're detecting conflict, we could move it and alert a conflict resolution mechanism, whether that's an individual or some other tool that can then come and repair the relationships before the problem festers.
Okay, great. Just a follow-up question as well. So does the model actually direct us or point us towards the specific pattern that it noticed, or does it just give a general evaluation of the trends and the conversation? Let's say, for example, I'm saying this because I've done some like sentiment analysis years ago. I'm not the dev person, but I remember what we stumbled upon with social media sentimental analysis was that it's hard to make something accurate because people are what's it called, like sarcastic a lot, and sometimes it can confuse like positive with negative. So does the model, for example, if a bunch of people in our Discord, they I don't know, they say write some positive messages about Vitalik, and a bunch of people will write like, oh, Vitalik is our father, and that's perceived as so would the model just tell us there's a positive message overall, or would it point us towards there's a positive message around like this topic specifically?
So we can ask it about topics that have a particularly positive sentiment and topics that have a particularly negative sentiment. That is not automated, but we can do it simply by querying it. However, when it starts to become really interesting is more when you combine it with the relationship. Because as you're saying, like maybe you and I, we joke and we're being a little bit sarcastic, and the model might pick it as negative. But if we continue talking, then that will turn positive at some point. Probably we're going to say, oh yeah, how you been, and so on. And that is a positive interaction. So you can more measure the rate of change in relationships rather than overall positive sentiment or negative sentiment. That being said, a community in general will have some sort of culture around their style of communication. So some communities might be more sarcastic or a little bit harsher or more cutting language. Others might be more warm language and so on. And when it starts to come to life is not so much by taking a snapshot at that point in time, but seeing the evolution over time. So you can start to get a feel for where your community is. And it's when you see the delta, like the change in the indicators, especially if there are spikes or falls, that you're like, oh, something is happening. And now you have the context of how your community has behaved over time to at that moment understand what that really means and take action or not.
That's amazing. Thank you so much.
Sure, welcome.
Daniel, I don't know if you mentioned it. Which platforms do you connect to? Is it Discord?
Yeah, so it's expanding. At the moment, we started with Discord. That's already live. Twitter is coming live soon. Probably Telegram is the next one. We're writing a grant proposal to get some extra funds and with that make the Discourse integration. But it depends on the communities that we're working with and the platforms that they prioritize. That's the ones we're going to build first. And then over time, we operate as a DAO, so it's an open project. If someone was like, oh, I really want to build this integration for our community, they can go and do it, and they can receive ownership in the project as a result of that.
Okay, and the other thing, how do you deal with the I don't know if there's a term for it, like a smart word, like permeability, I guess. Like, I don't know if someone is in several communities or different, like how do you know if a Twitter account that's interacting with Maker, for example, belongs to Maker, or just the fact that they are interacting makes them kind of like a community member? Is that the kind of like the premise?
Yeah, so I mean, in the long run or soon, but I cannot tell you exactly when, we can start to include other platforms that, let's say, WeWork, Wonderly, Coordinate, or other bounty platforms, etc., Snapshot, that are more related to people doing work in a community or completing tasks, or again, it will vary a little bit community to community, but we can also integrate those. That being said, the focus in general is a little bit broader, because what we're seeing is that organizations are moving from being very closed systems where you can very black and white define who's part and who's not, to something that is more continuous. And so you start to have a lot of people who participate in multiple communities. And at the end, if they're well connected to multiple other members in your community, what your community is becoming is a node in the system rather than an isolated entity. So kind of like from that perspective, it doesn't make a lot of sense to try to fully differentiate their part or not part. It's more they are in our orbit and how much they are a vital member, like at the core of the community, or how much they are more at the periphery. And that the network graph will calculate it. But it won't give you a binary member, non-member outcome. I mean, if they have never engaged with your other members across the platforms, you won't see it. And you can segment by data sources. So let's say if they're in your Discord and very engaged, well, that's going to count a lot more than if they're in Twitter talking with other people, because Twitter is a more open platform. So you can also make a bit those distinctions. But same thing, the boundaries are a little bit fuzzy. And we hope become increasingly fuzzier as organizations become more interconnected, open, and collaborative.
Nice. Yeah, that makes sense. I don't know if there's any more questions. I have one more that might lead into a tangent and philosophical. Yeah. Okay, I'll just shoot since no one's interrupting. But when you say something is too decentralized, like for some reason that almost seems like it would go against all the ethos in Web3, and people might try to lynch you with pitchforks in the public hall. So I understand that okay, this is too or people are not engaged enough, or they're too far from the core or the vision. But what does it mean too decentralized? Because usually, I guess it depends on your definition of decentralized, right?
Yes, yes, absolutely. The devil is in the details. From a socio-technical network perspective, like, so, pure technical infrastructure like blockchains and so on, that's a different thing, not what we're talking about here. We're talking a little bit more about the human layer, but also how they interact with the platforms and so on. In a extremely decentralized social network, you will have a sort of graph where there is no central node. So you won't even have nodes. It looks a little bit more like a fishnet. Very, very distributed, very, very divided. In these cases, what starts to happen is that the distance between community members increases a lot. So actually what you want as an ideal structure for information to flow and be processed effectively by the network is something that's called a small world. So in a small world, you have a few clusters that are very intimate. You can think about them as teams or subgroups, etc., that are in close, frequent communication with each other. And you have multiple of these subcommunities, especially as a community scales. If it's too decentralized, like if it's very diffuse and there are no central places, nor like subgroups where people can go, it starts to feel a little bit anonymous. And that's where you get those situations of, oh, in the old days, we all kind of knew each other. It was a very different feel. Now it's kind of big and I don't feel belonging as much and so on. So if instead of that, you start to have these pockets that form, you can still retain intimacy. And you can do a lot of the processing in these pockets. And what you want to do is then separate by topic or in some form have thematic differences across the different pockets. So this happens naturally in an organization. Most organizations divide by function, but you can divide by product or divide by geography or divide by whatever you want. The specific way to divide will vary depending on each community. But the important thing is you have the formation of these subgroups. And then in the subgroups themselves, we know that an effective communication pattern is relatively distributed. But if it's completely distributed involving too many people, usually you don't have enough influence in certain places so that the network can move forward. So it's a little bit hard to understand sometimes, but although you want everyone to have a voice and a vote, you want everyone to have equal opportunity, you want everyone to be able to access and participate in the network relatively easy, you still want to give space for leaders to emerge. Like the idea is not to get to a leaderless organization, it's more like a leaderful organization where there are many, many leaders and more people can become leaders and take prominent positions and influence others. And that becomes a more effective and resilient system than one where you have no one who's allowed to take any power. It's more about the way in which we grant that power and the way we keep that power accountable. Now, if it becomes too centralized, it's a disaster as well. It becomes fragile. There is, again, too much distance between community members, like the information architecture of the network just kind of collapses. So you end up having a middle. And if we're going to really talk about DAO theory, I would argue that the ideal that we want for DAOs is not centralized, is not decentralized, is more polycentric, which is a few centers of decision-making that overlap a little bit. And anyway, this is based on theories of managing the commons and information processing and so on. But the fundamental idea is that you can still have some form of centralization, but in smaller pockets, not necessarily taking over the whole thing, and manage. And it's a balance in between how much people form these subgroups, but also making sure that the community doesn't become too fragmented. That's the other indicator, because if the subgroups are not connected with each other, then also they don't align, they don't collaborate, and you end up with a lot of silos, and the community splinters and goes in different directions, and it's only a matter of time before there is conflict. So it's kind of like a balance. I don't know if that makes sense. If you want, I can go a little bit deeper.
Yeah, no, it does. I think we could go here forever. So I think I'll just force myself to stop, and I don't know, we can keep going over a coffee next time we see each other.
Yeah, that'd be great. Cool. Any other questions?
Yeah, Danielle, I found the idea of, an ecosystem's health being made up of the different nests very interesting. If you could real quick, just on the ecosystem piece, I guess how the data input works for different ecosystems to scale, to measure the dApp's health, and also if a project is running on multiple different chains, sort of how that might work.
Yeah, of course. So this is an area that is not yet fully developed, but the direction it goes is the more we start to gather data from different communities, we can start to aggregate these data and have a sense of how healthy the ecosystem is. So then if the health, let's say the health indicators of your specific community are going down or up, you can compare that to the ecosystem at large and be like, well, are we doing something different, or are we just following the trend of the ecosystem, and this is part of the ups and downs? Then the other thing that we can do is start to calculate, related to a previous question, is start to calculate what's the overlap in members in between us and other communities. And by that, because we can see how these people are super active in this other community and also in ours, so then these two communities have some good level of proximity. And the more you have an overlap with other communities, that's going to be your close ecosystem. And so from these, we can, like, very organically bottom up start to see the health of the other ecosystems. Now, we cannot tell you whether there's going to be a technological failure in one blockchain and not another. So that would be a solution for a different tool. But at least at the social layer, we can do this to see, depending on the ecosystems that you're the most present, the most enmeshed, the more relationships you have in those areas.
Great, thank you. Well, this has been an excellent presentation and demo. We really appreciate you taking the time. Yeah, while we wrap up here, what is the best process for people to reach out to you, and if they want to integrate with TogetherCrew and start using the tools?
Yeah, absolutely. At this stage, the best is to reach out to us directly. So either in togethercrew.com, you can find our contact details, or the easiest is perhaps in Twitter, just together_crew, and send us a message. We'll be very happy to respond and help you go through the steps. Probably by the end of next week, there is going to be a mini version that is fully open that anyone from the website can just install. But still, if you want to have access to some of the more robust and complete indicators and all of that, you need to engage with us. So just send us a message and we'll be very happy to help you integrate and figure out how best to approach it for your community.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Daniel.